You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Diane Jones Allen, Program Director for Landscape Architecture at the University of Texas at Arlington. We chat about her work on food deserts and transportation access and the ASLA Climate Action Plan. Stay with us. Calling all transportation professionals, the Shared Use Mobility Center is hosting the 2023 National Shared Mobility Summit from May 2nd through May 4th in Chicago. This year, we're coming all together now for action and accountability for people-focused mobility. With speeches, workshops, panels, networking, and field trips, attendees can learn about best practices in shared mobility that they can implement in their communities. Join for a conference experience you've never had before at the historic Merchandise Mart Plaza. Go to summit.sharedusemobilitycenter.org to learn more and register. Second wave discounted tickets only last until March 15th, so grab yours today. That's summit.sharedusemobilitycenter.org. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful Patreon supporters, past, present, and future. We really can't thank you all enough for the support, whether you've supported for a month or over 5 years. Join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards and support Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. $2 a month gets you stickers, including our Cars Are Cholesterol sticker, and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks everyone from the advocates to the bus drivers that support this show. Go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire to support. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can also get our transportation scarves, sign up for our daily newsletter started in 2006, or get our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice by going to theoverheadwire.com. Also, in the show notes, you'll find links to the bookshop.org affiliate store and link to purchase some of our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, designed with the great help of Richard Wazensky. Follow him on Instagram at DickDavidSketches if you get a chance. Thanks for all your support, and we look forward to sharing with you what's next. Diane Jones Allen, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I am a licensed landscape architect. I am the director of landscape architecture at the University of Texas in Arlington. Arlington is between Dallas and Fort Worth. It's in the DFW Metroplex. I've been here just since 2017. I moved here from New Orleans, which is where I've lived most of my adult life. I guess I'm kind of interested in everything that has really to do with underserved communities, from transportation to climate adaptation to migration.
Well, how did you get into that? What was the first inclination that you're interested in urban issues and the issues that you focus on in your work in teaching?
So my undergrad is in painting. So I have a bachelor's of fine arts.
That's
awesome. I have
a
master's in landscape architecture and a PhD in transportation engineering. So, and I think those things all relate. Most people say, what? It's not really related.
No.
And I'm like, yes.
I think that's great. More people should have painting backgrounds and MLAs and...
Well, painting actually was good when I was studying landscape architecture because I really could understand color and shape and form making, composition, those kind of things. But I think when I was studying landscape architecture, and I was lucky, I studied at UC Berkeley, which is a great place because, you have very pristine landscapes to Oakland, right? So you have real diversity and issues, and then you have beautiful landscapes. So I think, studying there, and too, I was lucky because one of my professors was Randy Hester, who was very much, even way back then when I was in school, he was ahead of time because he was really thinking about community engagement and how to deal with the issues of underserved populations. So I think that's where I got that from Berkeley, which would make sense because Berkeley is Berkeley. And so I think that's what sparked that in me. And then when I, was in New Orleans, so I actually was in Baltimore on the East Coast, and I actually taught at a HBCU, Morgan State, and I was doing a lot of work in Black communities. And then when I was in New Orleans before and after that, at post-Katrina, I moved and went to live in the Lower Nine and started working there, which kind of shaped my issues into environmental justice and climate kind of action. When I was in Baltimore, although in New Orleans, I too saw how infrastructure and transportation is really linked to those issues, especially when it came to Katrina, right? Because Katrina, people were like physically trapped. Like people who didn't have cars couldn't get out. Those are the people that you saw. And so then I started doing research. Like my PhD research was on transit deserts. So I was looking at communities that have been pushed. I mean, that's the thing with the migration, right? So there are all these migrations, Michael Eric Dyson talks about submerged migrations, which are these migrations when populations are pushed, really, like Great Migration, when a lot of people were pushed out of the South for fear of lynching. And then, I started to look at this other migration, gentrification and other things. And even before that, redlining, which pushed people into certain neighborhoods. So late after that, the push, the redevelopment push, that pushed people out to the urbs where you didn't have transportation, where you couldn't get to work and your job.
But in other cities as well, because I actually was living in Austin when Katrina happened, and a lot of people moved to Austin, to Houston, to other cities in Texas. And actually, one of my best friends, he met his wife because he was in New Orleans, and then he moved back to Houston, and then they met. And so that kind of thing happened as well, where people were just kind of meeting as displaced peoples from New Orleans. And I feel like a lot of people got pushed out, and a lot of them never returned. Even my neighbor upstairs, who's from New Orleans, she wasn't pushed out. She'd lived in San Francisco for a really long time, but she had friends that came to San Francisco from New Orleans and kind of created a New Orleans community here because of that. So it's really fascinating to hear about that kind of that push for folks going not just outside to the burbs, but around the country.
Around the country, yeah. And often those things are linked to environment and where people live.
I want to go back to a comment you made a little bit earlier about the transit desert and your work on that. And you also wrote a book about it. And I imagine that book came from your research mostly.
It grew out of my PhD, although, I realized when I was doing my PhD, I realized I had to do a book because, my PhD was for civil engineering with a focus on transportation. And so, my PhD had to be very, very technical, but I was really interested in the social issues because I'm a landscape architect. And I was really interested in these social cultural issues, which my PhD chair was not. So I said, okay, I'll do the PhD and then I'm going to write a book that'll talk about all these social cultural issues related to transit deserts.
Yeah. It's called Lost in the Desert, Race, Transit Access, and Suburban Form. And listeners to the show are likely to understand issues faced by people in transit deserts. But what was something that surprised you when you were doing research for the book that you didn't understand before or you didn't realize before? Because I'm sure you understood many of these issues from being in the field for so many years, but there must have been something that kind of popped out at you.
Yeah. So what did pop out was that, a transit desert wasn't just that it was a place where there wasn't transit access. I mean, that's the main part is that, for instance, some suburban areas that don't have transit are not transit deserts. And that's because nobody there cares to have transit, right? If everybody's in a place and they can get around, right, then it's not really a transit desert, right? Because everybody can get around. So to me, the way I defined it, I guess, and through my research, I began to find that a transit desert is a place that there's a hidden population of desire, right? There are people who want to get around, but they have no access. So if you have a place where it's designed for cars and everyone has a car, but in transit desert, there's demand. There's demand for transportation and lack thereof. So that's like one of the big things. And that was kind of a debate I would have with people, and they would say, but it doesn't have transit, so it's a desert. I said, well, not really, because people have cars and they're fine.
Yeah, and there's folks that have cars, and if it's a far off suburb and they've chosen to live there, and I guess that makes it not necessarily a desert.
But often you have that suburban form, which makes people think that it's not a desert too. Like it looks suburban and you think everybody has cars, and you discover there's this hidden population of people that are, carpooling or hacking, which is like a form of, doing shared rides and paying strangers or doing other things to get around. And so it looks, it fools you. Like where I live in Arlington is kind of like that. Like there's no quote unquote public transportation. There's VIA. And so it looks all suburban and you think, oh, there's no need for transportation. But there is, because there is a hidden demand.
And how do you determine that? I mean, how do you determine which places are deserts and which places aren't, even if they look similar?
So there are three measures, right? So there's the form, the demographics. So the demographics are, how many people own cars, how many people work and live, a certain distance, probably beyond the quarter mile or the 2 miles, how many people live a certain distance where they can't walk, right? So those the demographic things, the form, and then also the transit availability, right? So how far are the bus stops? Are there bus stops? How many lines? Are there any bus lines? So you can kind of use those 3 measures of transit access, demographics, and suburban or urban form to determine if something's a desert.
That's really fascinating. Going back to New Orleans too, you also worked on the Claiborne Expressway, a little bit of some of the design and thinking about what happens to it next after Katrina. And you were disappointed by the outcome. I'd heard on some of the interviews that I read and some of the things that I'd listened to.
Yeah, we're working on it. We're still working on it.
I know. We've actually talked about it on the show like a month ago or so. Just, where is it now? What's going on?
Yeah, so that is really interesting. So we've worked on it under several different versions or different consultants. I guess I would say it that way. And there have been many studies on the Claiborne corridor because it's interesting, it's a perfect example of forced migration. We'll talk about it. So, in the 70s, they actually, were looking to put it along the French Quarter. But of course, that community had political and all kinds of power and they could stop it. And so instead, they dropped it in Treme on the longest stand of oak trees in North America, double LA of miles of oaks. They dropped this freeway and it caused all kinds of trouble, right? For instance, it de-densified the neighborhood, right? Because it was really kind of where the neighborhood kind of came together. It was a long neutral ground of oak trees. So it was where they would picnic and parade and celebrate it. It kind of was the unity of the neighborhood. And when they dropped that freeway in it, people started to do those things beneath it, but it did cause de-densification of the neighborhood and other issues. Businesses left and all kinds of things. People who could afford to leave, didn't want to live in front of the neighborhood, left. So it changed the neighborhood. But post-Katrina, and it's starting a little bit before Katrina, because Treme was one of the oldest Creole African-American communities in America. And so it was free people of color. And then it was, partially a French neighborhood. And the houses are beautiful. So it's beautiful. It's a beautiful stock of homes. So new people came. Gentrification happened. And so a study was done in 76. I think it was 72 or 76, where it was led by an African-American architect. And they did a wonderful study, but nothing happened with that. And then later to actually put stores and things beneath the freeway to recapture underneath the freeway. And then Kittleson, Goody, Clancy did a study, and we were just a small local consultant on that in 2013. And they did different scenarios, like bringing it down, leaning it up, taking down some of the on-ramps. And to their surprise, lots of the community didn't want it down. And the reason why they didn't want it down, because there had been another study out there, and it wasn't the study by the Black architect, but there had been another one, which had shown the freeway down and a daylighted canal, like a beautiful canal in the middle. But if you have a canal and turning it into a lovely boulevard, so if you have a canal and a boulevard, then you can't second line in that. The things that they do underneath the freeway. People are under at Mardi Gras. They have pop-up markets. Mardi Gras Indians come under there. But if you turn it into this beautiful, so it's kind of a misunderstanding of the culture, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other worry, too, was the gentrification that had started to happen post-Katrina because a lot of new people came. Population shifted. They thought that it would cross the freeway. And once you take it down and it becomes a beautiful boulevard or whatever, then people will be moved out. So some people, didn't want that to happen. And there were these 2 wonderful Black women who were able to work with the city and get another grant to actually stabilize underneath the freeway. And there's debates about whether it should come down. I mean, maybe it should, but it's nice to do something to claim the space underneath so that if it does come down, people kind of have claimed it. And that'll probably take a long time. So in the meantime, we're working on a project with Claiborne Corridor Innovation District to do a project underneath, which, is places for the pop-up markets and places for youth, skateboard park, stuff for youth and places for community to do the things they do, but in kind of a cleaner, more creative environment.
Do you think that politically anything like that will happen? Like anything, whether it's a tear down or whether it's the community stuff that happens underneath the freeway?
Yeah, so the stuff happens already, but will the dollars go to stabilize it? I think it will. I mean, just last week on MSNBC, there was a town hall about race and culture. Oh, I guess it was a National Day of Racial Healing, and they had a town hall. And the mayor, not the current mayor, but the past mayor, Mitch Landrieu, who had given the grant, he is now in charge of all those EPA funds.
The IIJA, the infrastructure.
Yes,
he's like
head of that money. Is it EPA? Maybe it's another.
He's like the transportation czar for the...
Transportation funds. Yes, he's head of all those funds. Thank you for correcting me. All those funds. And so that was his project. And so, we're working on construction documents now for the phases. So I think it's going to happen because there's funding for it, even though there is some pushback against it. There are people saying, oh, you should just take it down, which maybe you should take it down. But in the meantime, because it's going to take a long time to take it down, invest the funds. But I'm positive.
Good. Well, before we get to the climate action plan, I also want to ask about landscape architecture more generally. And I'm wondering what some of the common misconceptions are about landscape architects and what they do.
Landscape architecture is hot. Everybody tries to do it. Architects try to do landscape architecture and planning, and everybody thinks they can be a landscape architect. But there's a particular curriculum. So lots of times when I see architects, I love architects. My love to the architects. But unless you've had the training and grading and drainage and plant material and understand the earth, I've seen water run uphill on plans and all kinds of crazy stuff. So it is a true curriculum with a true set of knowledge. And I say that as a director of a program, but also as a trained landscape architect, it really does. and really, it is a hot profession right now because of climate change and COVID, believe it or not, right? COVID, because people realized that one place you could go that was free and you could be outside and be with are parks. So now municipalities are saying we should have more parks because during COVID, parks were one place where people could go. Right? You couldn't go to the mall or the movie theater because they were either closed or dangerous, but you could go to your local park. So between COVID and also the issues of climate change, right? Because landscape architects are the ones who really can focus on how do we capture carbon? How do we have more green? How do we deal with water? Places like Katrina, when the idea was to keep the water out, and then they realized, no, maybe we need to think about how to live with it, how to capture it. So, I'm a landscape architect, and I think it's the best profession in the world. Respect to all you planners and engineers and architects, but landscape architecture.
As a planner, I'll let that slide. We need all stripes to help out.
I said respect to them all.
Of course. Well, let's talk about the first ever climate plan by the American Society of Landscape Architects. And it's 2023. I'm curious. I'm surprised, actually, that this is the first climate action plan from the landscape architects.
There was a climate action report. There was a committee, and there was a climate action report that was done in 2017. And I was actually lucky to be part of that convening and work on that. And then there was a climate action committee that had been working a long time. And then there was a lot of different people, like Pamela Conrad and other people who've been working on, she was working on the carbon capture. So it's not like, this just happened. It's just, kind of evolved into, really now let's have a strong document. Let's have a field guide. But it's been like kind of a culmination of things that have been going on for many individuals for a long time.
Well, what started the process to get to this culmination of all those documents and this document specifically, which is very impressive?
So there was, like I said, there was a committee, and then there had been a climate action committee. But then that became, for this particular plan, it became a task force. So there were I guess seven or eight of us that were a task force. But there was a large advisory group, which was really great, made up of landscape architects kind of from different places in the industry. practitioners, academics, span the age range, spans across the country, types of practice. So there was an advisory group. And so the task force, we kind of discussed and kind of began, taking all the stuff that had been done over the years and kind of trying to formulate this. And we would pass it on to the advisory council, who actually would add and, did a lot of work to really make those things happen.
Were there lots of disagreements between the groups or between during your discussions about what should be?
There was lots of back and forth. Yeah. There were lots of back and forth. At one time, when we first started, it was kind of like, equity was kind of be the center, but then it ended up being one of the three. Just lots of, thoughts about, should it only be about carbon capture? That, and of course it shouldn't. More people want it to be more about water issues. So yeah, there was lots of back and forth, but that was healthy because that strengthened the plan.
Yeah. Well, the vision is to achieve zero emissions and increase sequestration of CO2, but there's so many factors we can't control, like the politics of a place or supply chains or things like that. So how do we get there under this specific plan that you all put it together?
Well, this plan, which I really like, is about putting the power in the hands of the community, right? Because communities can put pressure on their local politics, which, impacts national politics. So it's very community focused in a lot of aspects in terms of landscape architects, like learning from the community and understanding the communities that they work in, right? And then landscape architects helping to empower the community in terms of access to how do you access funds, how do you access the political structure, those kind of things. So it's a very kind of ground up approach, which I think is important.
And also one of the group actions is to develop a guide on how to partner with and influence federal and state departments of transportation, et cetera, planning professionals and things like that.
Yes. And it's not just for landscape architects, but also for the community too.
Yeah. Well, what would such a guide look like in your mind? Would it be examples or would it be like NACTO guides where they, put out transportation plan sections and stuff for, bus rapid transit and bike lanes and those types of things? What would it look like from the landscape architects?
Oh, it would be an action guide. Yeah. With some examples and then some tools, which is kind of like what, I don't know if you've seen it, but what the field guide is like.
Yeah. Oh, I really liked the field guide. I was really impressed by that. It was almost like a little Christopher Alexander. It was a little pattern language. There was like little pieces where you could put stuff together and get to the place that you want to be, but you didn't have to pick everything, but you could, pick and choose the little pieces that actually.
Yeah, like a little cookbooky, which I like.
Yeah, a little cookbook. How was that put together?
Through that same process, right? Through the advisory group at ASLA. The ASLA leadership also had a part in it. And task force. So the task force kind of starting stuff and feeding it, right? And then it comes back, so it was kind of like a transactive kind of process.
What was your favorite part of the plan?
There is a part in there about transportation, of course. I contributed a lot to the part about financing, like the different ways to help communities get funds through grants, using other people's money, government funds, those kind of things. And then I also contributed a bit about helping landscape architects learn about communities. How do you work in communities? What's that approach from listening and learning? Because lots of times I know in my work, I've gotten not pushback, but not a feedback that, are you saying that, you have to be from a community to work in it? And I always have to correct it and say, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. You don't have to be Black to work in a Black community or white to work in a white community, because I've worked in both. But what I'm saying is you do need to know if you're not, and you do need to listen and come in and respect the community's knowledge and try to understand and appreciate the history and the place, And if you do that, then you can work. But if you come into a community and you're not of the community and you think you know everything, then I think you're going to have troubles.
I think that's true in any profession.
Yeah. So that was a big part of the plan. And especially when it comes to climate, I mean, who better knows where the water flows and when it rains and what's really happening ecologically and environmentally. And they might not have those terms, but they know that stuff because they live it.
Well, you've mentioned interest increasing because of what's happening in climate change. And we just saw here in San Francisco, we got a day where we had like 5 inches of rain, but people were posting pictures of bioswales on the street because they were doing their job. And so I think that that's something that has been popping up, and people are taking notice of what's happening or what has happened already and maybe how to implement that further. And I imagine this plan tries to do that as well.
Yes, yes. And people do notice those things.
They do. I think something that also I find fascinating, and I think something that doesn't get enough attention in places like transportation and planning, is ecosystem services. And I think that the value of land, the value of undisturbed property,
Yes.
and how it can put more value on processes that are already occurring over things like, and I appreciate green infrastructure, but if there's already green infrastructure there because the ecosystem is taking care of it, then green infrastructure might seem more like gray infrastructure when it comes to that. So I'm wondering what your take is on ecosystem services and how that can be implemented as something that states and cities, regions can focus more on, because I don't know if they've been doing that as much in the past as maybe they should.
It is so difficult, right? Because of society, especially capitalism, because when you see vacant land, usually we think it's vacant, right? It is useless. We need to put a development on it. I live in Texas where they want to put a development on every land, everywhere. But, but if you see a vacant lot, no one thinks it's doing something good. It's absorbing water, right? If it has trees on it, it's providing oxygen. No one thinks that. They think, there's the site of the new shopping center, or there's vacant land, there's going to be crime, so it's that's a really hard thing, but it's about education. And I think, like you said, more and more people are paying attention to these things and realizing that landscape has value in itself. I was just interviewed by somebody that was doing an article on green infrastructure in, cities, or protecting from storm and flood. Yeah. And so the use of green infrastructure. And then they were saying, well, one of the guides they were reading was saying, you should cut down trees, right? Because in storms, trees can, cause damage and hit power lines. And I was saying, yeah, but trees have roots, which actually stabilize the land, right? So, trees are really important, because if you eliminate all the trees, then you're probably going to have more erosion, right? Because you don't have something that's holding the soil together. But it's things like that. I was reading this really interesting article about the city where there was a project to put trees in the neighborhood, and they went to this Black neighborhood, and the people didn't want the trees. And so, of course, they just made this negative assumption, Black people don't like trees. What's wrong with them? But it was because in the past, trees had been taken out of their neighborhood for some kind of development purpose. So a bunch of trees historically had been torn down, had been taken down. And then also when trees were planted, they were planted not properly, right? So they broke up the sidewalk and they caused problems. So the problems that they had, the reason why they didn't want the tree was not because of the tree, it was because of city history, because the city had, it was a freeway or something nearby, and they tore out all the trees. And then when they put trees back, they didn't put in trees the right caliber, they didn't put them in the right way. And so it caused broken up sidewalks and all kinds of things. So it was this kind of negative experience they really had with, the city or those in power who were responsible for putting in the trees. It wasn't the tree themselves. So when people came this time saying, here's some trees, they were like, no, because A, you're probably not going to put them in right. And then when you feel like it, you're going to come and cut them all down. So it's just our relationship with nature and education on both sides.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really important point, because there's also people that don't want trees sometimes because the trees that have been put in the past, like you said, there's some other externality that comes with them, but also the care and feeding of taking care of trees. And you plant a tree, but then don't water it, it's not going to grow. And so it's going to be an eyesore. It's not going to grow very fast. So it's going to be this little stick in the ground versus, what we see in plan drawings and stuff all the time where the trees have magically grown into these 20-year, 30-year trees, which we know that doesn't happen when you plant the tree to start with. But, there's all these other things that come with it, with planting trees that, might be detrimental or just, they're not taken care of. There's also a study, I think in the Lancet yesterday or the day before, a couple of days ago, about European cities and how 3 or 4% of morbidity in cities comes from the heat island effect. And they could actually mitigate that by planting 30% tree cover in most cities. So there's there's human impacts as well for some of these things that I think really needs more attention. And I think that that's an important part of the discussion overall of cities is kind of the natural effects of greenery and the heat island effect and all these other things that are part of our urban environments.
Yes.
So environmental and climate justice is also a very important part of all this. What did discussions surrounding these initiatives look like when you were crafting the document?
Well, environmental justice was really, really important. And it kind of dovetailed with this thing about empowering communities, right? Because often what happens is communities, they feel powerless. A good example is post-Katrina. A lot of people went and did a lot of things down there that didn't really work well, but it was because people felt desperate and powerless. So they kind of let other people decide what was good for them. And then also, environmental justice is about the fact that certain communities, whether in New Orleans or even here in Texas, we've been working with some freedmen communities that are along the Trinity River. So they've been placed in these low-lying areas where there are issues of flood, or they've been placed, we're working with a community that lies between a cement plant, the Trinity River, and a railroad. So they've been kind of put in these places where they're vulnerable. But often it's tricky too, because a lot of these places, like this particular town neighborhood, they've been there for a long time, the 1800s, they've been there. And so, or just like the Lower Nine, people have been there for centuries or decades, and they don't want to leave. It's their home. They just don't want the disaster, they just don't want the oil refinery or or the bad flood design, or you destroying their wetlands, or, you dropping the cement plant, which came, in this case in Dallas, came way after, right next to them, right? So they love this land, but it's just that things happen that threaten them.
Yeah. Without their consent too.
Yes, without their consent. That happens a lot.
From a transportation standpoint, what stands out to you about the report as a PhD in engineering, somebody who focuses on transit deserts, thinks about transportation as policy?
So there's a good section in the report about transportation, which I really liked, and other people contributed to it. But I read it and said, yes, this is good and right. Because I was having this conversation with my students the other day, right? And they live in Texas. And they were saying, Dr. Allen, people in Texas are not getting rid of their cars. I drove here to school today. We need our cars. We need our spaghetti. I don't care what you say. And so my argument is we need to have transit diversity, which in some areas we don't, right? We need to have it so that it's accessible if you need it and want it. And that's the problem with transit deserts. There's no transit diversity. So we need to have it so that people of all incomes, if I want to drive my car, I can drive my car. But the car should not be the dominant thing, right? Because we kind of designed for the car. We put freeways everywhere, and very little do we think about bike lanes or rapid bus lanes or, rail or all the other things. Very few places are transit diverse. And so this plan kind of outlines the fact that, it talks about having it so that people can get different places without having to depend on their car, or to be able to, I think it said by 27% or 27% of like all the carbon is coming from, our transportation, but to reduce that. And I think we can reduce that by, giving people choice and being more diverse. And like here in Texas, like I said, where I live in Arlington, there is no bus. There is no public bus. And the light rail, the DART, doesn't come here. There's a TRE, a train, like this rapid train system that goes from Fort Worth to Dallas. It runs through Arlington, but it doesn't stop. So there are like political reasons where places where people don't want transit diversity, because maybe they don't want diversity. I don't know. But I am proud of the plan because it does address the issues of we have to be more multimodal. And, I think about it in terms of equity and people getting places, but the plan thinks about it in terms of we want to have a healthy world where you have to be more multimodal.
You're trying to reduce emissions overall. You
Yes.
have to focus on that big chunk that comes from transportation. It makes me think of the difference between a place like Arlington, which has chosen, and actually is the largest city in the country that does not have a public bus system.
I mean, when I moved here, 6 years ago, I was like, oh, I'm going to live near the school and I'm going to walk to school. I'm going to take the bus. Or, my husband was like, he's a bike rider. He's going to ride his bike. And we live close to school, but you cannot ride your bike because there is no bike lane.
Yeah.
The cars go really fast and you will get run over. I mean, I actually had to call. I live across from a park where people in my development, they get in their car and they drive to the park. I walk, right? But I have to walk across, 4 lanes or 6 lanes or something crazy to get to the park. And I've had to call the city of Arlington because I got almost run over. I mean, so close that I put my hand to stop the car and I touched the hood of the car. It happened to me 3 times. And finally I had to call the city and said, obviously this signal you have out here, people see green and they just want to turn left and they don't care that there is, the hand. They don't care. So they came and they put a longer time and then they put the counting.
The countdown
but
clock,
still, there's still people that, the lights
Right.
green, they don't care if it says counting,
That must be such a huge difference from, I imagine, where you were in New Orleans.
Yeah. And then, oh gosh. So last year I was on faculty development leave. I was at Dumbarton Oaks. I had a research fellowship in DC. So I was there for 9 months and I didn't take my car. And then I've been in this withdrawal since I've been back because I was living in Georgetown, and so there's a bus and then I could walk to the metro. I could get the commuter train and go to Baltimore and see my relatives.
Yeah.
I got the commuter train. And then I got on, the Amtrak and I went to Philadelphia. I went to New York, all by train, no car, all over because that little corridor is amazing, just transit everywhere. And then I come back here and you cannot get on an Amtrak and go from Arlington to Houston. I just couldn't believe it.
No.
I said, come on, I can go from Baltimore to New York or Baltimore to Boston. How come I can't get on the Amtrak and go from Arlington to San Antonio or something? And then my husband found it, but I think it takes 2 days and you have to go. It's not like, it's not like the East Coast where,
Yeah, I took Amtrak from Dallas to Austin one time, and it was a bit of a trip.
Yeah,
It was slowed down by some freight trains, and it was a mess. It's got to be easier.
Yeah, it could be, but
It could be.
Well, I think the train system is something we messed up in this country, but it could be, I understand there's pressures, oil, all kinds of things that cause us not to have.
We'll get there eventually. It might not be in our lifetimes, but we'll get there. I hope, anyways. So I think the action summary actually was the best place to find what the document is actually going to do. And I think that these 3 kind of points kind of give an overall assessment of what you all are trying to do, which is to make sure landscape architecture practice is climate positive, empower communities in support of equitable outcomes, and then build coalitions and guide decision makers to make positive change. And so those are 3 really important points I think that the document makes that seems like it's on the right track and going to actually work by 2040, which is the timeline that you're looking at.
And I like how it does it because, so it says you take responsibility, right? So as a landscape architect in your own practice, every day, how much carbon are you expending, in your business, getting to work, those kind of things. Then in your practice, what kind of projects are you doing? Are you doing projects that pave over everything or tear down forests or, so in your physical practice or how you live as a landscape architect, how are you, and then in the things that you're designing and seeing built, how are you doing that, right? And then within that, yes, how are you influencing the powers that be? Because as landscape architects, like I said, we're in contact with communities, but we're also in contact with city governments and council people and state people and people that are reviewing your stuff and all kind, So I like how it gives you is to empower landscape architects to kind of make this change on these kind of multiple levels.
Yeah. And how do you hope folks outside the profession get the plan? Like, how do you hope folks outside of landscape architects ingest it? Like, how do you hope they take it in and take it to heart?
So as a practitioner, or as an academic, you work with communities, students, other people. You can actually hand this thing to people. And you can, as I was saying before, if you're working with a community, you can enact the guide. Or if you're working with students, you can make sure that they, see this, understand it, so that they will enact it. So I think it would be given to communities in a really direct way.
Is there any kind of like public education process for it? I know there's parts in there which are talking about, make sure that the media has access to people who are experts in the field, and make sure that your curriculum is part of this when you're teaching at school and all that stuff. But like in the general public sense, like, is there some sort of a way that you all are going to reach out and like tell people what landscape architects are all about and make sure that, like, I'm just thinking about, there's all these messages in media these days about, what the right way is to do things and how we're supposed to tackle climate change and things like that. And I'm wondering what the big kind of public outreach would look like.
Yes. So there's a plan for that. So two things. So at the ASLA convention that was in San Francisco, there was like a big push to the profession, right? To landscape architects there, right? There were, educational workshops and seminars and, give everybody the plan, and it was given to them digitally or, get a hard copy or, And so there was a way and still through the chapters, through the local chapters, to educate landscape architects. And then there is, what we're doing, right? So there's a plan to talk to, and landscape architecture, ASLA has been having this big media push through many media outlets. So that is important. We're trying to do that at the local level, like I said, through the chapters, and then also, at the national ASLA, and through like talking to you and other people like you and sending it to newspapers and those kind of things.
Yeah.
And like I said, also, most importantly, I think like one-on-one with communities as you practice or do community or service learning.
Yeah. So what's next? What's next on the agenda for the plan for you moving forward?
Well, I hope, I haven't gotten this official from ASLA, so don't quote me, but I hope there's always some kind of assessment, right? Like, we probably need to have some kind of assessment, maybe in, I don't know, 4 years, 5 years, 2 years. I don't know. Like, what happened? Did it work? Where are the measures? How do we assess this? We probably need to start working on that. And then for me, I have my practice, and we've been doing a lot of interesting but sad, on one hand, work. What
does that mean? Interesting but sad.
So just past July, we did a memorial for Tamir Rice. The 12-year-old was shot in Cleveland. And then just 2 days ago, somebody else was, killed in the street, Tyree Nichols. So this stuff. And, whether those kind of things should have memorials or not, that's another question. But so we did that. And then we're actually working on a lynching memorial in Fort Worth. So the work is sad, but it's important.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you can't let people forget, or we're going to keep having these things. And then in my academic life, I'm writing a book. It's called The Maroon Landscape, A Cultural Approach to Climate Resiliency. So it's about maroon slaves who lived in coastal Louisiana and how they lived and how people have, like, to this day, kind of captured and been inspired by this legacy and are actually doing coastal restoration based on this kind of indigenous, I will call it, paradigm. So I'm working on that. And that's kind of exciting.
That is exciting. That sounds awesome. Well, where can folks find you if you want to be found online?
At UTA, of course. And then Design Jones, www.designjonesllc.com. That's the URL. Yeah.
And then where can folks find the Climate Action Plan if they wish to find it?
Oh, yes. They can go to asla.org. And I was there, and it comes right up. Yes.
Perfect. That's awesome. Well, Diane Jones Allen, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you. You're very kind.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. And you can sign up for our 16-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.